My name is Glenn Hope, and I was an SRE at Facebook for a few years. And before that, I was on Facebook's SRO team, which meant I had like a billion user fire hose pointed directly at my face, and we were responsible for the entire site. Before that, I was in academic supercomputing, but I'm not really here to talk about me today. I am here because a few months ago, I posted about some of this stuff, and Casey sent me a message and asked me to put together a talk, and here I am. So this is the talk. It's about what a gigantic social network is. And because I'm an SRE at heart, it's through the lens of the threats that a gigantic world-scale social network faces. So before I get going, there are a few disclaimers. Nobody who works there, sorry guys, is like going to be surprised by anything I say here. This is not some revelation. This is just a really, really broad picture painted with a really broad paintbrush. I'm not an expert in all this stuff. Hopefully you can see that. And there is some sort of mature/heavy content here, so I don't recommend watching the VOD with your kids. There's a ton I won't cover, and lastly, and this is kind of important, I am not here to defend these companies, and I'm not here to criticize them. Whether or not they're like gigantic world-eating monopolies, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm just here to kind of tell you what they are. So the scope of the talk is companies, social networks that have, say, arbitrarily like 100 million plus daily active users, and they store some sort of user data. So profile pictures, DMs, you name it. And then they have some sort of just like planet scale infrastructure, users all over the world. And when we're talking about this scale, a lot of stuff changes. For one thing, you are under constant scrutiny. You are constantly being watched all day, every day, by regulators, by the media. Your every single move is just constantly being examined by people. When Facebook announced Libra, financial regulators were asking them to shut it down the same day. And you also just have, obviously, extreme technical complexity, which we'll talk about. You are a constant target for all sorts of adversaries. And generally, at this scale, you run your own data centers. So these are kind of the people I'm talking about. There are others, and there are exceptions, like Snapchat doesn't run their own data centers. They have an unbelievably huge cloud bill. But these are kind of the players that I'm talking about. So first off, I want to talk about that physical infrastructure. Because when you are running at this scale, it is almost always cheaper to run your own data centers. And a lot of people online were shocked by this, and they thought, like, why don't you just move the whole thing into AWS? And one, that's ridiculously expensive, and two, it's ridiculously hard, and there is a reason that these companies do not do that, and it's because you can save a fuck ton of money by doing this yourself. The problem is, when you do it yourself, there is a lot of stuff that you have to think about. If you're building your own data centers, you're kind of functioning as all of these things or contracting with people to do all of these things for you. It's ridiculously complex. And on top of that, when you're building a data center, you also need to like think about where you put the thing. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to put one in Oconee County, South Carolina. No, you have to think so hard about like, are there going to be earthquakes? Are there going to be forest fires? Are there going to be, I don't know, like riots? Are there actually people there who can do this work? Are there educated, skilled workers nearby? Is the government going to try to tax us into oblivion? And on top of that, once you pick your location, you also have to think about the actual threats to your data center. My favorite example of this, I used to work at Oak Ridge National Lab, and there were like cameras all throughout the woods around the lab. And I remember asking someone, like, I heard there's motion-activated cameras in the woods. Is that so that like spies don't get in and steal national secrets? And is like, what? No. It's because people from the next town over will drive over here and break open the air conditioners to steal copper for meth. Like, I would never think of that. If I'm trying to set up a data center, I would just like think one level deep, and it's like, okay, no national disasters. I'm just going to set it up here. But there's so much more. There's so much complexity in just where you build it, how you build it, what you do. It's not you just throw a bunch of computers in a room and plug it into the internet. There's a whole world of things you have to do just to make one data center work. And some of these companies are building multiple data centers in multiple countries every single year. So let's talk about something that I imagine most everyone in this room is a little more familiar with. I certainly am, and that's code. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I tried to sort of distill 4 different classes of problems that you just see more at this scale. It's not special to these companies, you just see a lot more of it. And the first one is what I like to call cascades. And it's this way that a tiny little change, somewhere far away in your infrastructure, someone just changes one config file in some service that you have nothing to do with, you've never even heard of, and then the entire website's down. Or your service, excuse me, burped. Or your service is having like random timeouts and you have no idea why. This means that every single change has to be regarded as potentially dangerous at this scale. My favorite example is one time someone was changing values for a single host in a service discovery platform, like DNS but better. So he goes in and he's like, oh, I'm gonna change like the port number that this service runs on. So he goes in and he goes like, da, 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 and puts it as a string instead of an int or something. And the entire Facebook empire just dies. Jesus, sorry. just dies. Everything goes down. And this kind of thing is not rare. There are people in this room who I can see who can tell you all kinds of horror stories about someone changed some config that you've never heard of for some service that you didn't know existed, and everything came crashing down. Once again, I am so sorry. Anyway, so the next type of problem is what I call cumulation, which it turns out is a word. I had to look it up. And this is where itty-bitty little problems, tiny little things build up over time. My favorite example from my work was alarms. So you get one alert a week for something being broken. Who cares? Whatever. Dismiss it. No big deal. But over time, these things can really build up. And when you're talking about like a globe-sized, there we go, like people all across the world using your service, and you have endless petabytes of data just firing around all the time. Little things can grow at an unbelievable speed and overwhelm you. Let's see, hopefully that won't happen again. There we go. But the number one cause of all slowdowns, outages, bugs, regressions, weird behaviors, downtime, breakages, you name it, it is someone made a change. Somebody changed some code. I worked in developer infra for a long time, and I can tell you that the number one cause, without any doubt in my mind, you ask me, oh, hey, a big social network had an outage, what caused it? I will take $1,000 and put it on, yes, somebody changed something, every single time. And the problem is, you might have 10,000 engineers making multiple changes to multiple code bases every single day. And it's not just that you can go like, oh, well, freeze code, and then it's, then we have perfect reliability. For one thing, you're trying to like build a product. You can't just tell everybody, hey, don't do your job so we can be reliable. But then say around Christmas, you do want to do that. Stopping changes in itself a change. So one outage I remember, they were like, okay, from Black Friday to Christmas, no changes. We're going to freeze the site, nobody changes anything. Well, there's a little memory leak in one of the web server processes, and now that we're not pushing the site every day, the memory leak, and then on like Christmas Eve, the whole site goes down. And when we talk about the site going down, we talk about the fourth kind, and that's catastrophes. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with some sort of catastrophe. At every scale, at every company, you're going to have things where stuff breaks. The difference at this scale is that things break all the time. I mean constantly. Like there are literally meetings every week for, hey, what catastrophes happened this week? You have like processes for, oh, hey, what's today's catastrophe? Like, how do we keep track of today's gigantic world-ending problem? And it's so normalized when you're working at this that there's just constantly problems of all different sorts and sizes. And here, let's take a quick look at some examples. And I'm sure some of these are familiar to some of you. And hold on one sec. My favorite example here, I just heard about. So when I posted about this, people were like, tree taking out fiber, that couldn't have happened, which one, it did. But someone in the comments told me in my new favorite catastrophe story, where someone is using a backhoe outside of the data center, is doing some necessary maintenance work, and he hits the buried fiber cable. Bad. So, fiber-seeking backhoe hits the underground fiber. So the guy panics and raises up the backhoe and backs up and takes out the aerial fiber, and the whole data center's down. Like, you cannot just assume that bad things are going to happen. You can't just close your eyes and be like, oh, it's probably fine. You have to be planning for these things at all times. And I have no idea what this is about, so sorry. There we go. So also, unfortunately, I don't have a ton of time to talk about this, but these in red here and lots of others, there are things that can kill a gigantic social network. And when I say kill, I mean like erase from this mortal plane. If you have massive data loss, that could be the end of your business. If you reboot every single cache box, and I don't know, you guys have been working there a few years, I haven't been. Maybe you figured this one out, but okay, good. So if you reboot every single cache box, say Facebook could be down for weeks. To repopulate that cache with the just ridiculous amount of traffic they're getting, it could take days or weeks just to repopulate the cache and get the site back working. And if you are down for weeks as a giant social network, that's lights out. People will leave for your competitors and they will never come back. So anyway, that is enough about the easy stuff. All of that, that's simple. That's the stuff that we kind of understand. We write code, we get it. It's a technical problem with a technical solution. This is where we get to the hard stuff. So when I say adversarial threats here, I mean something where you have a counterparty, somebody on the other end of the line who's trying to outmaneuver you in some way. And when we first think of this, I think most people are like, oh, you mean like script kiddies or, spammers. And those people are threats, but when you are at this scale, when you possess, nations worth of like wealth and influence and power, your adversaries are like actual nation states who are very motivated to try and take you down or take what you have. And so here are just some examples of adversarial spaces that you have to think about at this scale. And unfortunately, I won't get to talk about all of them. One of the most interesting to me is the physical violence one, which I won't get into, but you actually have to worry about, wow, people might try to kill or kidnap our employees, or totally hypothetically, people might think your CEO is the Antichrist and perform ritualistic, they might want to kill him. No, I'll just say that. So let's get into stuff that's actually hard though, and that's spam. I think most of us, we think like, oh, spam's sort of a solved problem. You don't really see it as much anymore. And that's because these companies have done a fantastic job of fighting it for a really long time. But when you look at the problem, it is brutally hard because it is adversarial. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are out there constantly trying to evade the measures that you have in place. At every moment of every day, there's a fuck ton of people all across the world who are just constantly trying to get around what you're doing to keep them from spamming on your platform. And it's not a low-stakes thing. It's not just like, oh, there's some Ray-Ban spam. It actually can destroy your business. If you run a social media company, if you run a social network, and it is flooded with spam, people will just leave. Like, there are so many alternatives where they do a good job of this. And so you really, 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 really need to take spam seriously. Because if you don't, it can have a measurable impact on your bottom line. You can see as like spam goes up, money go down, advertisers leave, users leave, and a lot of times they won't come back. So let's talk about hate speech. I think that, obviously this is politicized for a lot of people, but I'm definitely not trying to get into that. For a lot of us, I think that when we think of hate speech, we think of just, oh, I hate black people or something like that. Like just people saying mean shit on the internet and they're kind of stupid. The truth is, these people are like very creative. They are very driven. People who want to do a hate speech on your platform, they're not gonna stop if they can't say the N-word. They're gonna find very clever ways to get around the measures you have in place. And if you don't stop this, one, advertisers are gonna leave. Do you really think that Pepsi wants, buy Pepsi, kill the Jews? No, in no universe does an advertiser want to be associated with that kind of content. And on top of that, do you really want to be on a social network where it's like, oh, I had a baby, oh, I hate the Jews, oh, kill everybody? No, it's a miserable experience and people will leave for a social network that does a better job. And hopefully, obviously, there are real consequences for this stuff. If you fuck this up, people will die. Honestly, people will die anyway. You can execute nigh perfectly on this, and people are still gonna get killed. You can't do everything. You can't plan for every eventuality. And I wish that my 2012 techno-utopian ideals were real, but they are not. I'm sorry. People will die. The mistakes we make on the platforms we run will get people killed. So, let's get a little bit lighter with misinformation campaigns, which is totally not politicized for anyone at all, and we can just skip over it. But actually, it's not just vaccines cause autism or buy Shiba Inu for 2069 shitcoin. It's actually a lot harder than that. There are companies who will pay contractors in the Philippines to run misinformation campaigns on your website. Organized, targeted misinformation campaigns on your website. There's a Wikipedia list of companies which have done this. And that's the easy part because nation states literally do this all the time. This is just, I went on Wikipedia and got a list of every country that is strongly suspected or confirmed to have run a coordinated misinformation campaign on a social media platform. Every single country that's in red there has run one of these campaigns. And if you're running a social media company, are you just gonna let that run unchecked? There might be some serious consequences for that, including people getting massacred. But here's something a little easier. I think everybody in this room gets hacking. I would hope so. It's pretty straightforward. Someone gets into your system and does something. We all understand that. But something that's sort of special about hacking is that a single individual, one person living in mom's garage, can cause billions of dollars worth of damage to your business. Just one. That's all it takes. Someone being very persistent, very clever, very lucky, they can get in and do incalculable damage to your business. And not just that, the attack surface is gigantic. It's not just oh, we have to protect this system. It's everything. Every one of your million hosts, if it's configured incorrectly or plugged into a public Ethernet port, someone can get in, and you have to be extraordinarily careful. And thank God I never worked on security because I just don't have the mindset for this. I don't get it, and I want to move on from it. So let's talk about something I think is really cool, which is that you can no longer trust your own employees at this scale. And I wish this were not the case, because I'm from that like 3,000 employees, it's a college campus, it's Disneyland, like kumbaya era of Facebook, where we all just like danced around and threw like rose petals in the air. It is not that world anymore. I'm sorry. I wish it was. It was really fun. But these companies wield so much power, influence, and money. And there are lots of very motivated people who want to turn your own employees against you. Or they're just employees that really don't like you and want to leak every product announcement you have immediately to the media. Maybe that's okay, but if you're a business owner, it kind of sucks. And, well, I don't know what that's up with. But there really are, you really have to take this seriously. Like, I would bet anyone in this room right now $1,000 that there are people at all of the major social networks who are, say, under the influence of the CCP or Russia or whatever else, that there are people who have been turned by nation states through coercion or money. And if you are running a social network, you have to think about this stuff. You can't just plug your ears and pretend this isn't a problem. And so with all of this adversarial stuff, it's hard. It's really difficult, and it takes a ton of work, a ton of coordinated work among people who understand this stuff and are able to think in that way. But that's kind of the easy stuff, again, because now we need to talk about privacy. And when I'm talking about privacy, I want to talk about like what a privacy org does. So a privacy org, mostly, they need to make sure your product it works with policy, which is based on laws, which are for every single country that you operate in. And they also kind of need to protect user data, regardless of policy. Like, it's a terrible user experience to have your DMs leaked to someone. And I won't really get to talk about it today, but this bit about and employees, super fascinating, because you have to protect user data from your own employees. I remember a story of someone who joined a social network, and in orientation, he was like, hey, how do I access this system? And they're like, you do this. And he just goes and like finds his wife's GPS data, finds out she's cheating on him, and then leaves. And of course, he got fired, and probably they pursued legal action, but like, you have to think about that kind of stuff. Not everybody is well-intentioned. People will try to take advantage of your systems. And finally, you kind of have to do all of this while you're building like a thing that people want to use, or you're building an app that people actually want to use and isn't just like data privacy, the app, which is very boring. So when we talk about privacy, I think most of us probably have heard of GDPR, and then maybe some of us know about CCPA. And I'll be honest with you, this is where my knowledge just cuts off right there. That's all I know. But it turns out like there is so much more than that. And that there's actually like way more than that. And that there's actually a whole world of that. Every single country in green on this map has their own privacy legislation. And if you're going to do business in that country as a social network, you need to be familiar with the laws of that country. You need to have policy experts who can tell you, hey, we're not in compliance and we need to update what we have, or else we're going to get fined. And these aren't like little baby fines. 4% of worldwide turnover is the max fine for a GDPR violation. That's lights out at this scale. 4% of worldwide turnover if you fuck this stuff up badly enough. And this isn't hypothetical. Like, this happens all the time. These laws are so complicated, they're in so many jurisdictions, and these companies are getting fined millions or billions of dollars for the mistakes that they make. And the consequences aren't just financial. Like, if you keep screwing up privacy, users will just leave. Like, if there's a company that just keeps leaking your DMs to people, or you can go to Snapchat, you just go to Snapchat. And not only that, advertisers don't want to be associated with a toxic brand who is associated with horrible privacy things. There's also the problem that regulatory scrutiny gets turned up every single time you screw this up. They ratchet it up. It's not like Like when you first start, maybe the regulators give you a little slap on the wrist and they're like, hey, do better next time. If you get a reputation for screwing this up, they come at you with the hammer from the very beginning. And of course, doing this wrong can get people killed. And I really don't want to talk about this. Researching this talk was so depressing. And there is not like a depressing slide after this, because when I was doing the research, I just cried and stared at the monitor for a long time at all the stories of people who got killed when someone read their DMs or someone saw a post they weren't supposed to see. That's not all. You actually need to like run a business and make an app that is fun for people to use. And if your privacy abstractions suck, people will just not use them. Your engineers will just, one, either be slowed down, or two, they'll just make their own privacy abstractions. And that's disastrous, because not only do they not understand privacy policy, you now have two privacy abstractions to maintain. And I won't talk about this now, although I think it's super interesting. Privacy code is ridiculously compute intensive. Every single interaction on any social network, these privacy abstractions are running, and the fan out is mind-blowing. But something we should talk about is the relationship between user data and law enforcement. So I'm going to pull this slide up, and I want you to look at these questions. Okay? So I'm going to show you some possibly fake, possibly real law enforcement departments. All right? So on the next slide, there are possibly fake and possibly real law enforcement departments with possibly fake and possibly real infractions that they might issue a subpoena for. So does anybody in the room have like a really clear idea on which of these they would allow law enforcement to actually like get the data and which ones they wouldn't? I don't. I'm terrible at this shit. I don't understand this at all. I don't know how in the world anybody can make this kind of call. You have the data. Law enforcement is issuing a subpoena. The thing is dying again. And you have to make a decision. You can't just be like, oh, I don't want to deal with it. No, this is law enforcement. They are coming to you and asking you for user data, and you have to give them an answer. And then if you say no, you probably have to go to court and defend that decision. So let's talk about the hardest bit. When I talk about content moderation, I'm kind of saying the things that you have to remove because you are legally required to remove them by the jurisdiction you're based in, or where the content was posted or viewed or whatever. And then, you also probably want to moderate content that decreases advertiser spending. Even if it was legal to have a video of someone burning a cat alive, maybe Pepsi doesn't really want that on your website, and they might put a little bit of pressure on you to not display it. And then also, obviously, maybe users don't want to see a cat getting incinerated. That kind of sucks and is miserable, and nobody really wants to see it. So you have to make some decisions about the content on your platform. I know we all like to think oh, we're the medium, not the message, but that's not really true. You have to make decisions about the content on your platform. And I talked earlier about these sort of adversarial threats. And these here are content moderation issues. But they're not the only ones. And this is the tip of the iceberg. You cannot leave this stuff up on your platform. Or have a good day with the AV. I'm so sorry. So, well, with that gigantically depressing slide back up, let's move on. And let's talk about just two of these. One of which is an empty slide, which you absolutely cannot allow on your website ever. And the other, hopefully soon, is hate speech. So again, politicized, we talked about it earlier. But the point is, you kind of do have to handle hate speech. And in particular, let's look at the example of Germany. Germany has the strictest social media laws on the planet, bar none. And I'm going to read just a little quote out here for you. If you're going to run a social media company, if you're going to run a social network in Germany, and you have over 2 million users, you should probably be familiar with the NetzDG regulations on social media, NETZDG, which stipulate that content must not violate sections 86, 86A, 89A, 91, 100A, 111, 126, 129 to 129B, 130, 131, 140, 166, 184B, 185 to 187, 189, 201A, 241, and 269 of the Criminal Code of Germany. And you only have 24 hours to identify and take down offending content. And if you don't notify the user exactly what you did and why, you can be taken to court. This happened to Facebook in 2021. They read NetzDG sections 86, 86A, blah, blah, blah. They figured it all out. They knew what they had to take down. They found the content, and they took it down. And then they got successfully taken to court because they didn't do that final little bit. This stuff is ridiculously complicated, and I actually highly recommend you check out Google's NetzDG page for YouTube, because it does a great job of talking about the gigantic armies of multilingual content moderators and policy and legal experts who are working 24/7 around the clock to moderate content just for YouTube, just in Germany. And I kind of wish that that was the end of the talk, but it is not, because we need to talk about CSAM. If you take nothing else away from this talk at all, ignore everything else I told you, if you run a social network of any size, you have to deal with CSAM. There's no wiggle room. This is the single most important class of content, and if it's there, you have to deal with it appropriately. And I don't just mean for some moral, ethical reason. I mean, you can be regulated out of existence if you screw this up. And hell, before the regulators even get to you, the payment processors will. Look at what happened to Pornhub. They weren't doing a good job with this stuff, and Visa and MasterCard were just like, see ya. No. That will absolutely kill your business. And it's not just that you have to deal with this. It's that there's a shit ton of nuance in how you deal with it. I thought it was just like, oh, child porn, you delete it, you're good. No. If you find it, you have to hide it. But you can't delete it because you need to let law enforcement look at it and investigate it. But then if it's soliciting or offering it, there's 6 different classes of this. This is the really simplified version. But if there's people saying hey, I can get you some, or hey, anybody got any child porn, you actually have to leave that up and report it to law enforcement so that they can honeypot it or track people down. And on top of that, a level of nuance that is mind-blowing to me, what about the napalm girl picture from Vietnam? Or somebody's baby photos? Do you prosecute them as having CSAM on the website? Do you take it down? What do you do? I don't know. That brings us to a very important point, which is that doing this kind of content moderation at this scale, it requires understanding intent and understanding the context within which it was posted in every single language on earth, even languages that maybe don't have a writing system or that you don't have any content moderators that speak it. You still have to. And that kind of brings us to this. AI is not enough. I know we like to think that it is or that it will be soon, but that's just not true. Humans are needed at every single step of the process. And to illustrate that, here is a slightly incorrect, vastly oversimplified chart of just dealing with a single class of content, just dealing with CSAM, nothing else. This is the way oversimplified version of all of the people and programs that are necessary just to deal with this one thing. And these people all have to be working together across cultures, across languages, across all kinds of different boundaries, and someone might be based, they might live in Indonesia, but they're from America, and they're grooming a child who lives in England. And all of these people have to work together to deal with that across national boundaries. And these people right here. This shit is brutal. I had a friend who worked on this a long time ago. And back then, they didn't get psychological help. They were just sort of used up and thrown away. And that brings us to the end of the talk, and to the conclusion of the talk, which is this: that tech companies are no longer just about technology. That there are problems at this scale that you can't just abstract away. You can't decentralize them away or encrypt them away. You can't write magic code that just knows if a picture is CSAM in every context on Earth. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be a very long time before AI is smart enough to do all of this for us. So in the meantime, what can you do? And I'm sure some of you have figured it out by now. There's literally only one takeaway from this entire talk, and it's the next and very last slide. And this is it. Hire good people, treat them well, and let them do their jobs. Thank you very much.
Amazing job, thank you. Questions? I'll run around with the mic.
So you talked about AI/ML on the content moderation side. What about on the production of really evil, toxic content side? And kind of, because that's the side that really scares me, is just the cost to produce child pornography, for example, is going to plummet to zero. And so usually that means higher volumes. And how's that going to work?
God, I wish I knew. But I think about this all the time. It's a war. It is an absolute war that most of us don't see. And I am not smart enough to know. I have no idea what's going to happen, but it's going to be a deluge of stuff. And I think it's just going to be a battle between these companies and the people working on this stuff across the globe, trying to come up with cleverer and cleverer ways to identify AI-generated content or just CSAM in general. Anybody else?
I have one.
Okay.
Back one slide, you had a list of things I think that wouldn't save us. I don't see blockchain on there, so.
Well,
does that mean blockchain is going to save us?
Oh, definitely no. I actually, an earlier version of this slide, I did have blockchain won't save you, and I was like, let's be a little bit more general with decentralization won't save you. But, I know I'm going to put myself on the internet saying this, but blockchain will absolutely 1,000% not solve any of the problems that are facing you, and it will create 1,000 more that are far harder to deal with, and you should not touch it with a 10-foot pole. And I'm sorry if that offends you. So with that said, does anybody have any questions? All right, cool. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you coming out to the